Okay, welcome everyone. My name is David Detomasi. I'm a professor here at Queen's University, and you're coming into episode number 4 of our podcast, or my podcast, Conversations with Dr. D. And with us today, we have Mr. Greg McLean, who is an MP from Calgary Central, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about, what his role is and and then how he sees the future of the country unfolding, potentially under a conservative government. So we look forward to that. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, David. Wonderful to be here. Appreciate it.
Okay, so the first thing is typically we want to give people want to know a little bit about who you are and what your background is and how you ended up getting into the political sphere. So just tell us what you can.
Well, I graduated with the BCom in finance from the University of Alberta back in 1985. So it dates me, quite frankly. But then, I found my way. I was initially hired at the Royal Bank, and I didn't like that much as being an administration. So I found my way into marketing. But at the same time, I was a big follower of Peter Lougheed. So I was on the executive. I ended up being the president of the PC Youth of Alberta. That dates me as well because that's the Progressive Conservative Party. And I ended up coming to Ottawa to be a policy advisor. Of course, at that point in time, you're in your early 20s, and you're drinking from a fire hose, and you're effectively becoming involved in the policy. You're working night and day, and you're making sure that what you're getting across the line for your ministers, who are your bosses, are effective. And honestly, one of the things I remember from that time is I was scared of losing my job every day. So that's when I first got involved in politics. Back in my early 20s, on campus, first of all, as a vice president of finance at the University of Alberta Students' Union, and then joined the PC party and, worked with the minority government here to try and make some positive change in Canada. And I think those years, I was 6 years here, and those years represented some significant and positive change, I think, for Canada. Went back and got my MBA at the competitive school, Richard Ivey School of Business in London, Ontario.
We'll edit that out later.
Okay. And went to work on Bay Street, went back into finance, worked on Bay Street for a couple of years, moved to a bank-owned brokerage, Canadian Western Bank's brokerage in Vancouver, and then eventually found my way back to Calgary, where I worked for a couple other brokerages before moving over to the buy side, as we call it. And I ran a couple of big funds in Calgary. People remember me most for my role as the chief investment officer at a company called Cavendish Investing, which was one man's money, really. And we did a lot of called high alpha investing, so a lot of venture capital, things soup to nuts really across my portfolio. I did that for 5 years, but we were about tech, biotech, oil and gas, other resources, usually with some technology built around the outcomes we were getting. So 2004 to 2009 was a good time to be a fund manager because fund managers get paid with a sense of carry, so you get participation in the things you succeed at. So we did a lot of oil and gas technologies, service technologies, mining. So the resource boom was happening in Canada at that point in time. And then I ran a family office from there, a larger family office, about $1.4 billion. And then did some work with Canada's credit unions at the end to make sure that we could get them towards open banking. And I have a license, what's called a chartered investment manager. So they need some help in getting all their various business industries across the line and how to be regulated and move towards a more technologically advanced solution. So that took some time as well. And we're still in the process of that. I think that Canada is a little behind in open banking. And I think we need to move a lot more quickly.
Okay, so finance pretty much. That's great to hear, particularly for us. Most of the listeners are going to be in a business school, and it can lead somewhere. And it also eventually led you back into the realm of federal politics. You're an MP for Calgary Central. How is it that you decided to make that leap back, and then what have you done since making that leap back?
Well, as 2018, I was on a holiday with my wife, and we were in Peru, actually, and going up to Machu Picchu, all those great things, and drawing a picture for you here. And then I basically told her, look, honey, I'm thinking about doing something different. And she says, what? And I told her, look, I think the country's going downhill financially at this point in time. We've got to get back to balance, and I don't think anybody in Ottawa is really paying particular attention to it. So I think I'm going to run for Parliament. And she bought in right away. I was surprised, actually, because it is a different life.
Yeah.
being in politics than it is being in business. So effectively, she bought in. It took me about 11 months at that point in time to get the nomination. Going through a nomination in the Conservative Party can be a bit of a slog. And there's all kinds of reasons around that. But 11 months later, I became the candidate in Calgary Centre. And at that point in time, you're kind of working about 3/4 times and campaigning the rest of the time. So it is a sacrifice you make at that point. You see your family less and everything else. But it worked out for the best, and we put together a great campaign in Calgary Centre. It was a Liberal-held riding before I was there, and we turned it into a Conservative riding. So it's a downtown riding. It's the most downtown riding in my caucus. Mm-hmm. So I do face issues that a lot of my caucus colleagues don't, because you look at the way Canada is becoming divided in so many ways. It's becoming divided regionally. It's becoming divided by class, but it's also becoming divided rural, urban, more and more. And you see that more pronounced than anything else. So most of my colleagues are in the suburbs or in the rural parts of the country. And obviously the issues that affect them and that are brought up at caucus are different than the issues that affect me in Calgary Centre, where I'm dealing with very urban issues. And much like a lot of my Liberal and NDP colleagues across the way, my approach to how we solve those problems are a lot different than the other parties are, and how we come out of this at the end of the day. And they're probably everything we bring to this job is based on our backgrounds. So with a finance background, I try and find some real practical solutions to solving social problems from that society is encountering at this point.
Well,
so that's how I got here.
Yeah, and what have you done
re-elected in 2021, and it's been interesting because it is an entirely different way. You think about the risk-reward structure involved in every other job you've had. This one is completely different. And there's all kinds of hurdles in this job. And believe it or not, it's very political.
Really? Okay. Say it ain't so.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, what types of positions have you had at once in Ottawa? I think you were a finance critic for a while, and then I think you're on the environmental side. Can you tell us sort of the things you've done, in the opposition role?
Sure, I'll give you a few snippets. When I first got elected, they put me on the Justice Committee. I don't know why. Then I worked on, when I chose Aaron O'Toole in the leadership campaign, and when he got elected leader, he made me his critic for natural resources. And that was, I think we were very productive at that point in time. And then after the election, I became the vice chair of the Finance Committee. And after being vice chair of the Finance Committee, I went back to being the natural resources critic once Aaron was no longer our leader. And then when Pierre got selected our leader, I was no longer in that role, but they asked me where I wanted to go, and I said I'd like to be on the Environment Committee. So we were very productive for the last year on the Environment Committee, because a lot of what we're doing in Canada for environmental solutions requires industry's input about how we're actually going to attain these solutions. You just can't come up with targets that are make-believe about, industry's going to do this with technology that's being developed. Well, being developed, if you've been involved in venture capital, being developed can be 12 to 15 years away from actual delivery. So you've got to make sure you're landing on solutions that are deliverable for the country going forward. I think we brought a lot of that perspective to the committee and punched holes in a lot of the false narratives that are being put forth by not just the government, but more so by even the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, and the Green Party, as far as false narratives, and I'll say that bluntly, around the energy industry in Canada.
Well, all right, let's move into that a little bit.
Let me follow up here, Dave.
Oh, okay.
Recently, I've been moved to the Immigration Committee.
Oh,
okay. And that's, you think about Calgary Centre, they wanted to have more urban voices on that committee, and I am the most urban voice in my party. And so it's kind of like, well, okay, Greg, go solve this. I've got some great colleagues in that committee. You look at Tom Kamick, he's bright, he's hardworking. I look at Brad Redekop, he's fantastic. He knows how to run a committee really well. And Larry as well from Manitoba. So we've got some great people on there that I work with, and we're hitting it out of the park. But it's not an issue that you can kind of sit there and go, what are we solving here? There's all kinds of problems around immigration in the country right now, and the balance we need to strike and make sure that we're actually bringing in the right people into Canada to make sure our economy grows. We're building a society that works going forward, that's cohesive, and that's a challenge. And we're going to make sure that we put our best foot forward on coming to the right solutions again.
All right. Well, you kind of jumped ahead, but it's great. The third question I was going to ask, and I'm sure, is what do you think the most pressing issues are for the federal government of Canada to be looking at? You've already named 3 or 4. You've talked about immigration. You've talked about urban-rural and the splits in Canadian culture. You've talked about the energy sector. So just elaborate on what are the most pressing issues, and if you can prioritize. I know that's tough, but governments can only do so much at one period of time. What are our priorities, and what should come first?
And yeah, priorities are something you have to pay attention to. So, all these people that come up with, okay, here's our 40 priorities.
Yeah,
we have 40 priorities,
a
yeah,
lot.
priorities. So you realize all of these issues are, important in their own perspective, but let's break it down. Let's go a little higher level, if you will, what the priorities of the federal government should be. Number one, our international reputation, which is taking a bruising under this government. In foreign affairs, we've got to make sure we show up on the world stage. We have the right defense mechanisms in place to make sure that we are where we need to be, and we can deliver whatever we need to at that point. But we also need to be taken seriously on the world stage, and that's happening less and less, unfortunately. Part of that, of course, is money. We can't afford a military anymore. We can't afford foreign affairs anymore. So the second thing I'd say is we've got to bring fiscal balance back to this equation and determine where the federal government's going to spend money. And that, of course, is about what does a taxation system look like? Taxing and spending is part of any organization. It is fundamental that here's what we do, here's what we don't do, because we've only got certain resources. So we have to make choices. Again, about setting priorities. Budgets are about what can we afford to do? How do we get this done? And there's going to be time in countries' histories where you do run deficits because you're solving problems today where there's future investments that need to happen, or stumbles that are happening, like a pandemic, for instance, that we need to spend massively right now, but we need to come out of this. We need a plan to come out of this financially at the end. So we're just not spending somebody else's money that we're not asking to pay for the solutions. And we've got to get back to that balance. And in finance, with my background, that's one of the main things. And the third thing I'd say, if I pick 3, is societal cohesion. Because all these things, rural divides, rural-urban divides, east-west divides, divides by class in this society, the misinformation that's causing people to drift and they don't know where it's going. This is leading to less and less societal cohesion and causing more and more friction between various actors in society, whether that's various levels of government or whether that's various the rich versus the poor, if you will. We've got to make sure that we're all in this together and that the country sees we're all in this together. So that societal cohesion includes, of course, a great legal system where people feel their rights are being respected. So those would be the top 3. If you ask me about the environment, which is something that I always talk about, I would say that ranks below those 3 but it does need to be included in the outcomes in that. But the top 3, of course, are what any government is looking to the future. You've got to have a balanced economy. You've got to have an international reputation that matters, and you've got to have social cohesion going forward. These are things that matter always for all governments, and I think we've drifted pretty far from those at this point.
Well, I think the public reaction and the academic reaction, at least some of it, is coming that way. I'll just cite a couple of people. David Dodge, former governor of the Bank of Canada, is worried about our fiscal deficit. He's applied with the Dodge rule that you want to make sure your debt servicing costs are something like less than 10 cents on every tax dollar we pay. I think we're at 14 right now. And there's lots of criticisms in Canada on the foreign stage. So, yeah, I mean, it sort of sounds like you would, I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I'll put my words in my mouth and you tell me that the federal government should do less better, or focus on really key priorities that it should be doing. Is that fair, or is that too much of a stretch?
any government needs to set its priorities,
Yeah.
but you have to look through what any government is doing and say, what is your priority here?
Yeah.
And if this government's priority, which it seems to be, is on the environmental file, where everything is impacted by we need to reduce emissions, number one, is failing. Number two, emissions are going up around the world. So we're not contributing in ways that we could to actually reduce emissions around the world. And it's looking at solutions in silos, including its spending solutions. You can't sit there and, flip a switch that solves one problem without, it affecting something else on another side of the equation. And so looking at this overall cohesion that has to happen, including with the balance of the economy, great, we're going to give more money to this one group. Well, that runs up the deficit and that increases inflation for everybody else. Let's take seniors, for example. If we just give a program to seniors who can't afford their rent and food anymore, okay, let's give more money to the seniors, which runs up our deficit, which causes inflation, which obviously takes away the earning power of those seniors, so that everything's going to cost more for them going forward. So we really solved a problem in that respect. Get back to the core fundamentals about what you're breaking here and figure out how to fix it, as opposed to just throw money at the wall and cause more problems than solutions.
Well, I mean, that's the next question I was asking you is, you've laid out those priorities. We've had 8 years of the federal government being run by the Liberal government of Canada, or Liberal Party of Canada, excuse me. Can you give me obviously your job in opposition is to oppose and to criticize. That's part of the role. But can you give me your views of what they've done well, what they've not done so well, and what they haven't done well, and just sort of see where we are at the end of those 8 years?
Okay. You take a look at what the accomplishments are of this government, and the accomplishments, of course, are that they've got much more participation of women at senior decision-making levels in the government. And that was a goal of this prime minister, and he's fulfilled that goal. Okay. And that is something I think that 50% of the people in this country want to see themselves included in the decision-making. I think that that's an admirable goal, and he has achieved that. Let's give him credit where credit is due. You take a look at what he's, the impacts throughout the rest of the economy on this. The thing about politics now, politics with this government has been about divide and conquer. So if you're looking at where you're tabulating the votes, the outcome of divide and conquer is conquest and division. And the country is very divided right now around this prime minister. So that's what he's cost us. There's a lot of social cohesion that doesn't exist. There's a whole group of politicians out there right now at the municipal level, at the provincial level, and at the federal level that are all about polarization. There's all kinds of, if you're not in my corner, then you must be in the far opposite corner, including on these issues around climate change. Like if you don't believe, and one of the Liberals accused me of this because I do have some, I think, very nuanced decisions and solutions around how we address some of the climate change issues around the world. But if I don't buy into the Liberals' decisions on their solution to climate change, then I am by definition a climate denier, which I'm not. And that is a way of kind of taking you out of the discourse on what the actual solutions for society are going forward. So we need to stop name calling. I've seen it in municipal affairs in Calgary. I've seen it at the provincial level, and you see it obviously in my regular job here. It's that, you're either with me or you're against me. So, well, maybe you need to do this job just a little better, because you might have 20% of it right, but there's 80% you can adjust, or maybe you've got 50% right and 50% you need to kind of listen to some other people. Stop listening to the voices that are just the voices closest to you. And by the way, I've given that advice to people in my own party on some of the social issues. I said, stop listening to the 100 loudest voices. Because the 100 loudest voices are just the 100 loudest people. They're going to scream no matter what you do. And you're going to get screaming on each side of the issue. The vast majority of society is looking for the solutions that work to keep us all moving forward together. And that's where we need to come as a society, as a party. And I don't think the Liberal Party has been there for quite some time.
Well, I would like to just follow up on that a little bit, because it's not in the question sheet, but when I follow politics reasonably closely, and the tone seems shrill, the tone seems aggressive, and is the tone overly dominated by those 100 people on both sides? I mean, when you work with people in the House of Commons, are most of them, the term they come out with now is normies? Like, have are more, or are they, or is it as divided actually in the House as one might think it is looking at headlines?
Yes,
Oh,
and I would say it's divided around the Conservative Party. If the government's major push forward here is on the green agenda, it does mean shutting down the oil and gas industry in Canada. And as you know, that's very important to my province and to my riding. The Green Party's bought into that, obviously. The NDP, when you listen to their narratives on this, it is misinformation, and we try and point that out all the time, where they get these numbers about the subsidies for the oil and gas industry. But it is a repetitive narrative, and like Catherine McKenna said when she was a minister, it doesn't matter if your information is true or not. It just matters you repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And that's what's happening as far as the demonization of one of Canada's biggest industries and our largest balance of payment provider. We are being demonized by many parties in the House of Commons, the Bloc Québécois also. It's the only one saying let's look at the facts here about what this means for the world's climate footprint going forward if we just did away with the Canadian energy industry, which seems like it's the motive of this government. Although they try and disguise that at certain points in time, much of what they're doing around that industry is, of course, causing more harm than good. And that's where we have to come to a solution here that actually is better for the world and shows where Canada participates in providing better environmental solutions for all our trading partners around the world, and not just those silo-ized solutions that look, Canada reduced its emissions, deflated its dollar to the point where it can't buy anything anymore, and effectively took itself out of the scientific leadership that it's had for decades in this industry as far as the reductions in emissions that occur here. So those are the misinformation narratives that is part of the political game now, and it is about divide and conquer, as I talked about earlier. You divide people against something that they see as the enemy, and effectively they line up all the ducks in a row. Now, the other part of this, David, that isn't painfully obvious yet is the amount of people that get paid in that process. A lot of them are interested organizations. They all have significant contracts with the government of Canada to provide information that is not scientific information today. It's guessing around what the solutions are going forward. But they're all government funded. And of course, they're all, if you don't mind me being a little brash on it, they're all propagandist organizations about, propelling that misinformation narrative so that people actually get solidified on what the only solutions are. And there are all kinds of good solutions out there about how we address climate change going forward, none of which have been presented by this government.
well, we have a couple of questions coming up that are going to give you your shot to to explain more carefully what those solutions could be. So then we're breaking it down now into some more specific issues. You and I are both familiar with Alberta. You live there, and you represent Calgary Central. I lived in Cochrane for 22 years, and go back there repeatedly. So I kind of know a little bit about the place. The relationship between the Alberta government and the federal government is at this point, shall we say, poor. just let's call it that. What what needs to be done to put those relationships back onto a more functional, effective path for both parties? I mean, we see in the news, we've got Bill C-69, we've got arguments over pensions, we've got lots of things. So can you maybe give us a sense of how that can be fixed?
Yeah. Number one, respect for provincial jurisdiction. So you take a look at our modern constitution, and it really became modern in 1980 between Premier Lougheed in Alberta, who was a brilliant leader, and Pierre Trudeau in Ottawa. And the whole thing around the National Energy Program at that point in time was a discourse that happened, and the discourse was between two different jurisdictions. I don't think people really realize the nuance of what happened there, because both, if depending on how you read the Constitution, both of those entities, the federal government and the provincial government, were acting within, within their actual rights, federal rights or provincial rights, and it was a different interpretation. In order to get that clarified, it took some people putting their heads together and actually discussing how does this actually transpire, and that is the price of oil that gets exported from Canada and who should benefit from that. And of course, Alberta thought it was its resource. And even though international trade is the federal jurisdiction, what the federal government was doing at the time was setting a made in Canada price and taking the difference between the made in Canada price and the world price when it went into the United States, because international trade is technically federal jurisdiction, but it is a provincial resource. And that affect, the price of the resource that you get, that the producers in Alberta got, it determined the royalties that Alberta got as well, because it is very much a formula driven by price and volume. So it was a manipulation about, okay, how do we actually get to some agreement between the two of us about how we're actually going to, how the province benefits from this, how this overlap in supposed resource value versus international trade. Those parties came to the table because there was pressure put on by Premier Lougheed to bring that to a head and bring it to the table. And that modernizing of our Constitution, giving clear distinction about the province are purely responsible for the resource development and the revenue that comes from that, was something I think that has benefited Canada enormously in the decades that have ensued, not just in Alberta, but all the way across the country. So that's something, respect for provincial jurisdiction, as opposed to this continual, and I've seen this after having been here 4 years. There's many pieces of legislation I deal with, which are steps into provincial jurisdiction. And whether we acknowledge it or not, the number one jurisdiction that's benefited from that ownership of your resources is Alberta. Saskatchewan to a large degree, and Newfoundland as well benefited. But the whole issue is this is provincial jurisdiction, and yet it benefits the whole country at the same time. I often tell people, what do you think the Canadian dollar would be worth if we didn't have an over $100 billion balance of payments surplus with our energy trade? And the answer, of course, would be below 50 cents US at this point in time. You do the math. Think about what that would happen to inflation in Canada. Think about the mix of foodstuffs we'd be paying a lot more for. This would impact us significantly if we didn't have that balance of payments differential. So this has solved so much for all Canadians. So there's two. There's respect for provincial jurisdiction, and of course there's the recognition of energy's role in the prosperity that we felt across this country. And I'd like to go into that further at some point in time here. But you also have to realize that on the environmental front, Alberta leads the country. Alberta led the country on a carbon capture technology, but it led the country first and foremost on the TIER program. When the TIER program is the first output-based pricing system in Canada, and they actually took 60% of the CO2 that's produced in Alberta. They have to either abate or provide a penalty payment to the government, who then invests in leading edge technologies that are about reducing carbon. And that's been going on over 20 years now. So we've been at the forefront of addressing environmental issues, addressing economic issues, addressing issues that are a benefit to the whole country and the whole world. And yet that respect seems to be ignored from the federal government's perspective. And in fact, the industry, the province, the people in Alberta seem to be demonized for the way they've actually contributed to the country. So that earning back of, the respect for everything we've done in advancing in scientific solutions, advancing an economy, the whole Canadian economy, the role we've played in bringing up everybody's standard of living across the country is something that I think that would be, the recognition of it would go well to kind of putting a Band-Aid on some of the blisters that have been caused by this government's relationship with Alberta.
Well, it's interesting. What goes around seems to come around. I can remember when I was a little younger than Noah, who you've met earlier, there were bumper stickers on the back of the of cars in Alberta. The quote was, "Let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark." And this was 40 years ago. But it seems like we're just fighting the same fights. I mean that was Peter Lougheed. Now we've got Daniel Smith essentially having to remake the arguments you just made about having to litigate provincial responsibility on C-69, claiming that, Alberta has a 50% of the CPP and perhaps threatening to withdraw. What's driving that? Is it anger at the federal government? Is it a legitimate policy position? Is it some combination of everything? When I go to Alberta, I will say I do sense a fair bit of anger, a fair bit of resentment. But it also plays into, we'll talk about this later, plays into what you said earlier, as I see it, a lot of places in the country are angry about something. But let's talk about Alberta. Is this legitimate anger, or is this real policy, or is it just some combination?
First things first, if you don't mind, let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark is something that Peter Lougheed would never have said.
I know he wouldn't have.
Peter Lougheed was a Canadian and a gentleman and would never have said anything about any other Canadian of any sort. That is a quote from Jean Chrétien, who was trying to paraphrase what Albertans were saying to the rest of Canada at that point in time, which again is about polarization of the issue around energy in the country. So we need to make sure that that is not attributed to any Alberta leader at that point in time. Albertans are Canadians, Albertans were Canadians. Peter Lougheed was a great leader and a great Canadian. And I say, if anybody ever attributes that to Peter Lougheed, I make sure I correct them pretty quickly.
Yes.
Yeah. The issue, you look at the friction that's been caused. It is that whole, and David, I know when you're out in Alberta, you deal mostly with business leaders. And of course, they're continually looking, okay, how do we work with this federal government in getting the program moving forward that recognizes where the country has to go? And they continue to run into loggerheads. So you can kind of see that frustration again and again and again. And yet the information about how Alberta is contributing fiscally to every program in Canada, the equalization payments, everything else, these are all social programs that get delivered in other parts of Canada that are based on what the numbers Alberta brings to the table in its prosperous years. Alberta also has non-prosperous years, let's not forget.
Yes.
But Alberta contributes to the equalization, the taxes flowing across the country in all those years, whether it's got its head above water or not. And that was the issue in the last handful of years under this Liberal government. Even when our economy was being pummeled, we were transferring from Alberta to the rest of Canada significant funds for social programs across the rest of Canada in provinces that were running surpluses, while Alberta was running massive deficits to keep up with their social programs in Alberta. So there's where some of the disconnect happens, because the formulation of these programs doesn't seem to make sense to people. And that's where you kind of get that, what are we doing here and how is this working and how are we making sure that we can continue to provide prosperity for the country? Because this really is about the country's economic future going forward that we're talking about. We're moving into, and I will say this quite bluntly, I don't think anybody in this current federal government knows anything about the economy or how it works or how it's going to continue to prosper going forward. I think they continue to kind of run around, well, we'll put some money in here. This whole issue around, our entire future is based on, clean energy minerals. And, I heard that iterated when I was down at the embassy in Washington. I said, well, the new economy is going to be the clean energy, the clean energy minerals we're going to develop in Canada. I go, so tell me how much you think that'll be. He goes, well, it could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars a trade. And I said, well, the oil and gas industry is worth over $100 billion a trade. So that's 3 zeros at the end, more than you're talking about on the critical minerals file. And it's kind of like hit the guy in the head. He was a deputy ambassador. I don't think they understand what they're actually talking about at the end of the day, where we fit in the big picture here on what we're providing the country as a whole, but what the future looks like for the various economic sectors that we seem to be tilting towards and throwing a whole bunch of taxpayers' dollars at. And the moral hazard on it, the risk we're bearing as a country now is extreme because we've gone all in on one file. And, I'll talk about this because I do believe in electric vehicles and their role in where they actually fit in our transportation mechanisms. But if you overstate that role, or if you push too hard on one technology associated with electric vehicles, like lithium, eventually you'll get what Toyota's looking at here, which is an iron, a solid state battery, which doesn't include lithium. And if you've made tens of billions of dollars investments in one battery technology, it suddenly gets eclipsed. You have to realize you've got a big write-off happening very quickly. So this is taxpayers' dollars. We've got to make sure that we actually get some professionalism in how we actually look at the risks associated with the various sectors, the various energy delivery mechanisms going forward, and make sure that we're represented in each of these technologies, but not putting, not throwing, the wallet at the wall on one solution alone. There's going to be many solutions here to decarbonization of, the energy output of Canada over the next 30 years. And that's, where we have to make sure we've got, representation in geothermal, representation in the evolution of hydrogen, representation in, better distribution mechanisms, because like the International Energy Agency said last week, we're going to have to build millions upon millions of kilometers of distribution of electricity in order to serve the needs without motive power being replaced. I mean, the entire infrastructure for electricity around the world is 40 years old. So it does require replacing. It is not something, and that replacement will require copper and aluminum. And the more we mine these things, the more energy is going to be expended. So the more energy expended, of course, the more energy we're going to require. And the more energy we require, we're going to have to find more energy solutions for that energy that's required. So this is a spiral that people haven't really got their heads wrapped around yet.
It's interesting. And listening to you talk, I can see where, at least what I'm getting is I can see where your finance background comes in. Because if you're managing a portfolio of investments, I would probably, unless you're a really big risk taker, you probably won't have a number of things that you want to allocate capital to as a risk, just a sheer risk mitigation. And a couple of things you said, essentially what I've heard from you is basically do the math, look at the analysis, but people don't seem to want to, or maybe they can't, in terms of what it will cost and where the money will come from. And I find that's a big issue. I sometimes find in discussing public policy, people either don't want to or can't get the figures. Is that what you're seeing too, a little bit? And then we'll move into the specific environmental policy.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the climate file, if you will.
Sure.
How many Canadians do you think actually understand climate file? Okay. So it might dismay many Canadians that the IPCC, that's the United Nations body that has, the
Panel on Climate Change.
Exactly, the International Panel on Climate Change. It never talks about an existential threat, climate change. That is media narrative around it. It talks about, this is what's happening in the world. Here's the science, here's what we see. And it does talk very rationally about this. There might be some outcomes here if we don't keep this down below a certain threshold. So it is a scientific document. How many Canadians, if you don't mind me saying, read science? Read science magazines and those sorts of things is another question, because you actually have to look at the science. One of the things that I, when I debate in the House of Commons, I of course talk a lot about the economy. I talk a lot about finance. I talk about the things I know, and I talk about the solutions, because a lot of what I invested in when I was in venture capital were environmental solutions for oil and gas production, for other environmental solutions, including wind, including low-head hydro, including solar. So, I've got my bruises in investment from every one of these sectors, and you'll learn along the way there about how actually science progresses into actual deliverable solutions for society. And many of those are early stages at this point in time. We've got to acknowledge that and make sure we look at, are we throwing out the baby with the bathwater in some respects? I follow a guy named Rob West, and you want to talk about technically proficient. The site's called Thunder Said Energy. I know it's a mouthful, but he is scientific and analytical from a finance perspective at the same time. Sometimes it's way over my head because you are talking about resistivity in some of the solar panels. You're talking about technology that's effectively, you have to be a scientist to understand, but he does give all kinds of concise briefing notes on these and how they're going to work in the future going forward. But he's very hopeful about the low-hanging fruit, about how we actually address the majority of the decarbonization that needs to happen in society, and we actually come to solutions that are solutions, that aren't putting money into somebody that's a good lobbyist, if you will, at the end of the day. Here's where we actually solve the problem, as opposed to pretend we solve the problem. So you've got the public kind of just, oh my gosh, there's a big problem out here, and then the government goes, well, here's where we're going to throw money at the wall to solve that problem, without even looking at the other problems that overspending is going to create in the process. And one of the things I've always talked about, I've even talked about this with companies in Calgary, is the whole issue around biofuels. Because even when I was an investor, we looked at biofuels being more carbon intensive in their life cycle than the fossil fuels they were replacing. Now, that's a riddle that the government hasn't put their hands into yet. Okay, we're telling companies to do this. It's going to cost Canadians a lot more. And in the end, it will do absolutely nothing for CO2 emissions around the world. So anything we're looking at here that costs something for the consumer, there better be a benefit at the end of the day. We have to acknowledge that cleaner energy is going to cost more. I often tell people, as far as energy goes, think about it simply as you can on three axes. You've got reliability, you've got affordability, and you've got, well, we'll call it sustainability, but let's call it cleanliness. The reliability, you can't budge that. That is something that you have to have all the time. Can you imagine coming home and not being able to turn on your lights? Can you imagine going to work and not being able to work because there's no power available? So that reliability is a given. Make sure that is sacrosanct, it can't move. Therefore, and the other 2 points in that diagram, those two are going to have to move. The more sustainable, i.e. cleaner you make it, the more it's going to cost at this point in time. There is a trade-off there. And we have to make sure Canadians understand that and move towards that. So cleaner energy is going to be more expensive energy at this point in time. It's going to be for the foreseeable future. That cost is what we've gotten as a free ride on the carbon emissions that we've been expending for years. So recognize we're having an effect here. CO2 is an emission we need to control and find a way to make sure we control it so that it isn't cost prohibitive to control it and doesn't cause impactful problems such as the inability for people to eat. Food is obviously making sure that a society functions. Once people can no longer feed themselves appropriately, you've got all kinds of societal problems. And remember, we talked about those 3 things governments are really responsible for. Societal outcomes, and making sure we're cohesive as a society, is based on some fundamentals, like people being able to feed themselves, house themselves, and have a legal system that works. These are things that need to continue to exist. We don't need to, ruin all of those because we think there's we think we have an approach to solving the climate emergency around the world with a false solution.
Yeah, I mean, what I'll do is, I mean, you've been touching on it for the last 10 minutes, so I'm just going to combine the questions 5 and 6 that I've given to you. I said the energy sector is critical to Alberta and to Canada, and how do we reconcile our ongoing importance of the oil and gas industry with, the need to reduce carbon emissions, and the question number 6 was, critics of the Conservative Party yell and scream, "You have no clear environmental plan." What do you think of that criticism, and can you tell us what the Conservatives would do on that front, and then we'll move on to some other stuff.
Sure. In the last election, we had no clear environmental plan. The environmental plan we put forward in the last election was, pretend we have a plan and people will, okay, you got a plan. The corollary of that, of course, is that the government has no plan either. The government just has a way of kind of taking from Peter and giving to Paul in this case. And I think this weekend has been telling as far as the government, the Prime Minister, backing away from the carbon tax on fuel oil in the Maritimes.
The Maritimes, yeah.
Well, guess what? Fuel oil is more carbon intensive than natural gas heating in the rest of the country. So why are you punishing the way people heat their homes in one part of the country versus the way they're heating their homes in another part of the country? It is effectively, these are where my votes are. So I'm going to make sure that these people don't feel the economic effects of a bad taxation regime. And yes, I do believe that the carbon tax in Canada is a bad taxation regime. It's bad for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's all narrative. The narrative around it, of course, is that you get all your money back. Well, if you get all your money back in a carbon tax, then it's not a carbon tax.
Yeah, why
In
take
fact,
it
you
in the
don't get
first
all your
place?
money back, it's just a wash. It's a way of rinsing your money through government and coming back into your hands at the end of the day. It's completely bogus and should be discounted as the misinformation it is. We've got to actually come up with actual solutions here that actually show how we reduce carbon, and we make sure Canadians know what that's going to cost, how it's going to cost them, and they understand it going forward, because buying into solution is effectively what has to happen here. But back to your question there, you were talking about our climate policy. I've got, and I've worked with a number of industries as far as what are the climate solutions going forward. And it's interesting when you talk to these industries, because they admit behind closed doors that what's happening right now is leading to no environmental solutions going forward. The electricity industry, and we met with them numerous times. For about a year, they were telling me we won't need any new production of electricity and no new distribution in Canada. And then one day they flip-flopped and go, you're right, we're going to need two to three times the electricity production and the distribution associated with that. So that kind of mollycoddling of people, no, this will be fine until everything hits the fan at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Your race is going to have to spend a whole bunch of money, billions upon billions upon billions of dollars, in order to make this system work. And of course, they come to that conclusion at the end of the day. Yes, it's going to cost the country billions of dollars, and you can't put that on the backs of consumers, because consumers might include consumers that can't afford it. So therefore, it should be paid for by government. So every one of these industries comes to Ottawa, and they lobby the federal government. They buy into what the federal government is saying at some point in time. They won't speak truth to power, and at the end, they effectively say, "Well, we're going to have to subsidize us because we can't afford this." The other one was, of course, the steel industry. All the solutions around steel. I worked in a steel mill before, between high school and university, so I know a steel mill pretty well. And the thing about steel mills is they require carbon to produce steel. The whole thing about steel production is a chemical reaction between high carbon coal and iron ore. It is actually melting of the two together that produces hard carbon steel. You cannot escape that. This whole thing about biochar, we'll put biochar in there. Yes, I'm looking at biochar and the actual footprint of biochar, and hopefully it's one of the solutions going forward. But when the steel industry comes to me and says, look, you've got to subsidize us for the carbon tax because we're not competitive with the US because of the carbon tax, we need a subsidization. I'm going, you've got to tell the government that their carbon tax doesn't work in any competitive industry. It says, we can't say that to the government. Yes, you can.
You have to
speak truth to power here and actually tell the people your solutions are not a solution. It's not a carbon tax if anybody has to bear it, but then gets the money back at the end of the day because they have to be competitive. That's not what the whole thing is supposed to work like. And then, of course, there's the whole issues around how we get to green steel production, which at this point in time is a complete guess. And is there going to be enough electricity supplied in Ontario to actually supply the green steel mills? Because it will require a huge amount of electricity. Interestingly, I worked in a steel mill in Alberta, and it was an electric arc furnace at that point in time, but it's recycled steel. And that electric arc furnace was supplied by, at that point in time, primarily coal fuel electricity. So carbon footprint and all these things is source to use. You've got to measure it throughout its life cycle and not just at the point where you're participating in its production.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move away from oil and gas and the environmental policy. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about some other areas that clearly matter.
David, let me, if I may, I know you asked
Yeah.
about my party's environmental. I've been working over the summer on a bunch of environmental solutions. And I talked to my party about that because they moved me from the Environment Committee to the Immigration Committee. And I'm still working on those with my colleagues and still having some input with my colleagues on what our plan needs to be going forward. But like every one of us, I've only got so much time in a day. But there are some viable solutions I've worked with industry on about how we actually accomplish some reductions at the end of the day, and what are the best solutions for the country. And that's across industry. We've got to look at all the solutions, and like Rob West, who I referred to earlier, said, look at the low-hanging fruit. Don't look at the things that are going to cost the most. Look at where you can make some switches very quickly that reduce carbon and actually, get us moving forward without blowing the bank or blowing our brains out, if you will, economically on false solutions. So I hope we see more of that. I hope to continue to contribute to that, and well, that our next election, if it's not too soon, will have a very viable, very tangible environmental plan.
Well, it's interesting that you mention it that way. I think what I see out there right now is there's this two dual visions of innovation. One is the moonshot. We're going to throw a lot of money and we're going to incredible green technology and we're going to have a nice green world very, very quickly. And the other one is what you just mentioned, which is let's go after the low-hanging fruit with steps of innovation all the way along. I know the evidence pretty well, and the innovation route is actually really good. You can do a lot by just improving a little bit all the time. So that's I'm glad you said that. Okay. I got a quick question. It's not here, but I just wanted, it's on voting, and I just popped into my head, and it's just a curiosity that I see. And it's, you can answer it or not, but I'm just kind of curious. Why is it that polling is so often wrong? Like, I mean, we've seen this for lots of elections. People say this candidate's going to win by a landslide and they end up losing. And, this is not a close election and then it is, and this person has this lead and then they don't. What is going on in the world of polling, and why is it so often seem to be not reflective of reality? And I just curious. I don't know.
Sure. Selection bias. Let me ask the question. When's the last time you participated in a poll?
I once a year.
Okay. Well, effectively, most people that participate in polls are people with time on their hands to participate in polls. So, if you will, most of us, like, some guy's going to call and say, "Listen, anyway, look, I'm busy. I'll talk to you later." Right?
Yeah.
Thanks, but so no, most 99% of Canadians are exactly like that. We're not, we're not there participating in polls, and that's selection bias about, okay, who are we taking this information from? And often it's, people that have enough time on their hands to actually participate, or people motivated enough to participate in those 40 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, where the pollster tells you that what this is going to take. So selection bias is one of the main things about polling that kind of puts the scientific analysis of it out the window if you think about, what the results are. It is about, okay, we talked to 1,044 Canadians about this issue. Number one, how is the question phrased? Where were those Canadians? Were they urban? Were they rural? What parts of the country were they from? All kinds of questions need to be asked in this methodology going forward. And in the end, again, what was the selection bias here? And we talked to 1,044, but 144,000 Canadians hung up on us in the process.
Fair enough. All right, that's a great one, because I've been asked that many times and I didn't have an answer, and now I think I've got a better one. Let's move on to a couple of areas outside of energy and environment. Everything's interrelated, so it's not as if we can slice and dice the world. But there's two areas I'd like to talk to you a little bit about. One of them is social policy, and the other one's foreign policy. And one of the arguments that I sometimes hear is that people are wary of what a conservative government would or would not do in the social policy front. Would they, defund the CBC? Would they fund cultural industries and all kinds of things? Can you sort of clarify what the position is on that, and what Canadians should know about what the federal Conservative Party would or would not do?
Sure. It speaks to my background again, David. The issue, of course, is that you've got to have some outcomes-based analysis here. And, the best illustration I give is, okay, are we cutting $250 more in grocery credits for senior citizens now that can no longer afford groceries? Because the inflation has made their rent almost double in parts of the country. It's made their groceries go up by 10% a year for the last year and a half. Effectively, we are pricing them out of their retirements at this point in time. Does throwing $250 at a wall for them solve their problem? If it does it temporarily. If it increases the deficit, it actually does more harm than good, if you think about it, if it continues to whittle away at their spending power going forward. So we've got to stop looking at social policy in silos and getting credit for things that don't actually provide solutions at the end of the day. We've got to have full output-based solutions. These are outcomes that need to benefit society at the end of the day. Yes, we're spending money here. What is the societal outcome for that? Not just the outcome for the little group that got it, that might cause a whole bunch of problems for everybody else in society, but in essence for everybody, including that group, if it's something like inflation. We've got to bring inflation back to a real number that actually shows how it affects Canadians and mitigates it so that you and I and everybody that we know can plan for a sustainable retirement. We've taken that away at this point in time. We have to make sure we get back to it, not just by throwing money at the wall, but actually getting back to a base of money supply here that works for Canadians, so we can count on our government not running away with inflating our dollar going forward. And let me say, I'll go back to energy on that. If we did away with Canadian oil and gas production, that inflation would be rampant, absolutely rampant. So everybody's future depends on our continued balance of payment structure that is predicated around a prosperous oil and gas industry. This is where the government's hands are tied, and they know it. So they continue to talk out of both sides of their mouth on this, as opposed to saying, here's how you have to work with the government of Alberta and the energy industries to make sure that the production they have continues to decarbonize and adds value to the world going forward here as an energy source, but also adds value to the lifestyle of Canadians, particularly retiring Canadians, in making sure the value of our dollar is not plummeted because of the policies of this government.
Well, what about
Does
things?
that, I mean, I know I took social policy and turned it back into economic policy there.
What I mean,
But it is
people's.
that,
I'll
you know,
be I'll be the conservative critic. You guys don't care at all about diversity, equity, inclusion. You're going to roll back, things that we think are concerning in terms of human rights and how people identify themselves with their gender. I mean, all kinds of that stuff seems now. I'm not an expert on it. I could be wrong, but it seems to be something that people are really worried about a conservative government on those fronts. That's the one I can, I was talking a little bit, that's the thing that Toronto worries about, I think. Now, I could be wrong, but tell me if I am, because I think it's out there.
Well, I think that, and you look at the makeup of our caucus, but it is cause and effect, because you take a look at my colleagues that lost the last election because of the narratives around, and my colleagues that were women and my colleagues that were of different racial minorities, were BIPOC individuals, and and often we put forward those candidates because they represent their communities that they live in, they were destroyed by the Liberal Party's misinformation around this, around where my party sits on that. At the end of the day, you've got to be providing solutions for people. And you've got to make sure that people are providing the solutions they're designed to provide. Now, I'll go back to the finance world where I used to live. And I try to make sure that I speak cohesively about it in Parliament. The solution, you think about the banks that are failing in the US, and there may be more banks that fail in the US, but a few have failed already because they're not paying attention to being bankers. Now, you can't just sit there and tell the same bankers with the same cost structure, here's your new job, you've got to include all this in your analysis. You've got the same people showing up doing the same job every day, and suddenly, okay, I'm paying attention to this now. I'm paying less attention to the stability of the investments in my bank. And that's what happened in Silicon Valley Bank and the other ones that went, Signature Bank, that went belly up. They were no longer paying attention to what was the ironclad basis of banking, which is matching your assets and your liabilities. And that fell apart because people weren't paying attention to it. So every one of us has to pay attention to what we're supposed to be doing for a living, and don't let it go, because now you're supposed to focus on, I'll drift to the ESG, if you will.
Sure, please.
If you're a portfolio manager like I was, we looked at all those things all the time, but it wasn't part of our marketing. If we wanted an environmental solution, we get an environmental solution. If we wanted a social solution, we get to a social solution. My funds never invested in, Philip Morris, Altria, because We don't believe in that cigarettes were doing any societal good whatsoever. So these are the types of things that you decide as the portfolio manager. But when those, like the ESG, the numbers around how you actually calculate what's good environmentally, what's good socially, what's good in a governance perspective, are nebulous to say the least. And I think that people have finally clued into that, and you see the rush out of it. But it has been a ride of putting money in fund managers' pockets for a false narrative for half a dozen years now, if you will. And these are solutions where you actually have to say, what's the outcome here? I'm a portfolio manager. My outcome is to make sure that I have reduced risk and increased return for the people whose money I'm managing. I'm making sure that their portfolio is safe and secure. Number one, I'm not throwing money at the wall. And then I am building in a return profile that matches what the expectations are. And I will consider things like environmental because it's part of my mandate. Social, well, social is binary. Like, do I support child labor in Congo? No, therefore I'm not investing. It's a big 1 or a 0. It's as binary as they come. Governance, you have to realize from a governance perspective, governance is expensive. So when you're investing in companies, you have to realize early stage company, I'm going to spend less for governance because I know I want to put $5 million in this company and get their technology to a stage where it needs to be. Therefore, I'm not going to have a whole bunch of compliance committees and everything else taking all the money of the $5 million I put into this. You do accept that as a portfolio manager. You make sure you try and manage it as effectively as possible by the questions you ask, and, the returns they're getting going forward and what the outcomes are. But you do have to let go of some of the controls. Again, you've got things you can move and things you can't move. If everything was governed as if it was the Royal Bank of Canada, you'd have no innovation in this country.
Yeah. Well, that's a couple of great points, right? Is A, companies are different. B, people are sometimes talking about ESG as if it's this new thing that no one ever did before, as if no one ever considered these factors when they're allocating capital, when in fact, companies have been doing this forever. But it also has in some cases, and we also see Larry Fink and some of the big drivers in the United States backing off on some of this. I'm not quite sure they ever fully expected it would become as big a deal as it has. And I think you're seeing now some withdrawal, and let's get back to basics stuff. Another question I had on social policy was on foreign policy. Now, I'll just phrase in a couple of observations I have, and then you can talk about the conservative government's vision, because you said that way at the beginning. We need to reinvest a little bit in how we are viewed in the world. There's two things I see when I talk to Canadians. One, I think they overestimate how much other countries take us seriously, that if we do something, other countries will somehow be influenced to do similar things. And the second thing I see, and I think is a bit of a mistake, is we sometimes think the Americans are always our friends, as if somehow, they will do nice things for us because we're their neighbor, which is a very Canadian way of viewing the world. But I don't see a lot of evidence of that. I see a lot of evidence going the other way. Like, they're going to look after theirs and they don't care about ours as much. I mean, as you would expect, I don't see us getting a whole lot of breaks simply because we're Canadians when it comes to relationships with the United States. Now, those are just a couple of observations. You can comment on the observations and then maybe talk broadly about how a conservative government might approach problems of foreign policy.
You are exactly right. You think about when the free trade agreement initially was signed between Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan back in 1988, it was monumental. And to have a tribunal actually, a two-country tribunal actually making the decision about where any conflict happened between the two countries was revolutionary. But now it's more or less, okay, they're our most important trading partner, and we do a significant amount of our trade with the United States. But whenever they don't like what's happening with their domestic industries, they just change the rules anyways. And we just kind of like, well, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
And so the issue about having one really good friend in the world isn't something that we should just take for granted. We've got to continue to nurture that relationship. And I will tell you that I remember when Prime Minister Mulroney, negotiated that free trade agreement with the United States, the first thing he had to demonstrate was goodwill and that he was stepping up and spending enough money on defense so that we weren't just a free rider on the NATO system and the NORAD system. And he made that commitment, and he showed that commitment before Ronald Reagan actually came to the table. So there is a trade-off as far as security in the world and our standing that we're helping, with the world's problems going forward here with the United States, not just a free rider on the security they need to provide to countries like Canada. So we've got to start making that commitment because they do spend more as a function of their gross domestic product than we do on defense. So step up, Canada. Make sure that we understand that that is actually something that is not discretionary in the world for where the federal government needs to spend money. There's all kinds of places the federal government spends money and builds bureaucracies to work and just transfer some responsibility, accountability, and potentially money to the provinces for them to deal with. But defense and foreign affairs and our respect on the world stage are sacrosanct for the federal government. And we have, we've blown it. We need to get back to reality here as far as where our trade relationships, how we're respected around the world, where we need to diversify our international trade going forward. So we're not just so dependent on one country. And we worked on that for years. And in that respect, I'd also say, we need to make sure we continue to have discourse with China. A lot of people in my party even have said, well, we need to just treat them like we can't trade with. We're going to trade with China. You think about how important an actor on the world stage China is, how much of an investor in the Canadian resource industry there is. We need to make sure we ring fence that so we're not actually having some security problems around this. But Chinese bring capital, they bring technology. They also take technology that they learn in Canada to make their production more environmentally beneficial. So think about all of the outcomes. All these outcomes are gained, not siloized. We've got to make sure we're looking for better solutions and how do we look at all those inputs going forward, not just the headline grabber that says, here's my black and white on this. No, you actually got to actually say, here's our principles on this, and here's how we work within those principles.
Fair enough. We're drawing to the end here a little bit. I'll just reiterate, I do know I liken our investments in foreign defense policy to insurance and to stepping up to the plate so that others would do the same. A classic example over the last year has been, of course, the desire for Canadian energy expressed by the Germans and the Japanese and our ability to get them to them. You have to pay your dues if you want others to take you seriously. Is that a fair way to phrase it?
That's so fair. It's unreal, right? Germany comes here, Japan comes here looking for LNG, and we say there's no business case for it. Well, there's all kinds of business case for it. We're just choosing to ignore it at this point in time because it benefits, a part of the country, an industry that this government doesn't view favorably. We've got to get past that and look at how we actually contribute to emissions reductions around the world. And when people come begging for a commodity that does reduce emissions for them, we have to think about CO2 in the world, not in Canada. Look, our footprint went up in Canada, but it went down around the world. And there's been some significant analysis around this. It's called Scope 4 emissions. Think about CO2 emissions, Scope 1, 2, 3. Well, the Scope 4 are the avoided emissions by the production, what you're doing. Nothing is perfect. And the number 1 and number 2 Scope 4 emissions are LNG and natural gas for power consumption, because you're usually switching off of coal. And coal, as we know, is the one that has the highest carbon footprint, as well as other environmental effects of coal. So we've got to make sure that we understand that this is part of the solution. Even though it is a fossil fuel, it is something that is reducing emissions significantly around the world. The rest of the world is there. Qatar is going to raise their natural gas output by 60% before 2030. And Canada is sitting on the sidelines saying, well, we only see it as a transition fuel, so we're just going to ignore it. The rest of the world isn't ignoring it.
No, a paper I wrote with Noah here said exactly that. The Mexicans aren't doing it, the Qataris aren't doing it, the Norwegians aren't doing it, the Australians are, but we. All right, couple of things. I know you got some time here, so I'm 2 more questions I wanted to get to before we finished up. One is there's still a bit of time between now and I don't know when the next federal election exactly must be called, but I think it's 18 months, something like that. And in what we don't, lot can happen in politics. So what does the Conservative Party need to do if it wants to win the next federal election over the next 18 months? What is it that you're thinking about that the party has to do in order to eventually form, a majority government, or at least one that has, well, we'll go with a majority government. What has to happen?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, it's 4 years is what the fixed election mandate is, although that gets broken by a minority government whenever they want. So that it could happen at any point in time, but the fixed election would have us at more or less the end of September 2025. So it could be a full 2 years hence. However, constitutionally, they could just change that legislation and make it another year. So it could be constitutionally as far as September 2026. And we just require a little bit of a change in the House of Commons in order to do that. And they could do that if both they and the NDP see that as being beneficial. What we have to do, and let me tell you a story, and it's one of those things that is a frustrating story. I was at Stampede and stopped into the TMX's, the Toronto Stock Exchange's event. And of course, a lot of people know me there because I worked with them on structuring product for years, and participated with their staff on many issues. And I walked in, and of course, people are saying hi. And I'm speaking to a gentleman who is actually a corporate securities lawyer in Vancouver. And he's telling me about how he can't stand his MP. And his MP is a Liberal, and perhaps I shouldn't name the MP here. But effectively, I go, yeah, I hear what you're saying, here's what we're doing. And so about a 5-minute conversation about how bad his MP is. And at the end, I say, listen, I hope we run a really good candidate in your riding in the next election. And he says to me, oh, I'll never vote Conservative. So there is brand damage there, right? You realize that, okay, you recognize you've got a terrible Liberal member of Parliament and you won't vote Conservative. And that's the same when I talk to people in Montreal that are looking for a different Liberal candidate than the one they have in an election. It's like, you do have options here. Well, we're only going to vote for Liberal. It's just the wrong Liberal. It's like, okay, so we've earned some brand damage here for, I think, hanging on to some issues that don't need to be our focus. And David, I'm socially moderate. I'm pro-choice. I'm pro-LGBTQ. We need to make sure that people aren't voting against the Conservative Party because of something that should not be part of our agenda. Now, this is brand damage that's happened over the last decade. I don't know why it's sticking so much, but we've got to make sure that we carry the ball forward, that this is not our agenda. And you need to make sure our leadership team reiterates, we will not do this. We will not be in this. We are very clear about what we are going to do when we govern here. We are very clear we will not be touching any of these issues. Abortion is one of those issues, legislation around abortion. The human rights around LGBTQ individuals is very important that we maintain going forward here. Those are things that my party has to make sure that we are solid on, and make sure that focus on the things we're going to change, because there's a lot that needs to be fixed in this country right now in order for us to have a positive outcome. What we're aiming for at the end of the day, of course, any government should be aiming for, is good government for Canadians, a good future for Canadians, a future where they can see we're delivering something for our kids that's better than the society we had. We're not tearing down, we're not dividing and conquering. We're actually building something that is the basis of a great country where people want to come from around the world.
Well, that's a great way to segue into the last question, because the primary audience for this podcast, well, I mean, is going to be my students, but it's also going, well, an interested Queen's alumni. And, some of them are starting to develop their own political views. Some have them already. And at some point, some of them, I know a couple have run either for city council, but might consider running for office themselves, either at the local, at a provincial, or at a federal level. What would you tell them? They're 22 years old, or maybe 28 if they're in the MBA, or whatever, or maybe. What would you tell them about that? And how would you phrase this vocation you're in?
This vocation is about public service. And it's about bringing something to the equation where you say, here's where I can contribute, where I think I add value. And that value is often earned value. So my number one recommendation to students, before you consider a career in politics, consider what you want to accomplish in the world and how you can gain that experience where you can actually bring some value to the discussion going forward. Now, some people will have that because they've been involved in certain issues of life. They'll have that in their early 20s or mid 20s or 30s. You think about me in a financial career, I was in finance for 23 years. I think I had some value here on the financial front. But make sure you know what you bring to the equation here. Parliament is full of MPs in all parties, mine included, that don't have any life experience, that just represents, we need somebody that looks like this, we need somebody in this tribe, and they find themselves here victims, if you will, of, okay, here's all I'm supposed to say, here's all I'm supposed to do, and they are constrained as far as their value input goes. Now, if you want to be somebody else's messenger along the way, it's a path forward. I'm going to suggest to everybody that you find your footing, you look at where the value you want to add in public life, and see where it goes from the experiences you're going to gain, first of all. I'd say that you do need some life experience to come here and actually add value for Canadians. And that might be in business, that might be in social work, that might be, in your work with a club where you're adding value, to charities around your city, with things you want to change. What is it you want to see here? And where's the value you bring to the equation that says, here's where I think the government's getting it wrong right now, where I think we should be doing better. And then, of course, run that by some other people, run it by your friends. You have a dinner party and goes, here's what I think. And get feedback, because that feedback matters. But I say, I look at, and it's kind of the Liberal NDP mantra, and I look at some of the candidates we run against, they're primarily driven by demographics as opposed to experience. So whenever you're voting, look at your candidates. Look at your candidates and look what you think they've done in the past and what you think they'll do in the future as far as the value they add going forward here. And I remember running against a candidate in the last election, the political science professor at Mount Royal University, who they're interviewing, goes, and my candidate was discounted as being unexperienced, and the political science professor goes, well, that candidate's learned the lines really well, like as if learning the lines that are given to you by the Liberal Party of Canada makes you a good candidate. And so it isn't something where, okay, here's my speaking notes and look how well I deliver them. At the end of the day, think about how you actually add value, like you do in a company. When you go to a company, do I fit in here? Do I add value? Where's my spot here? This is something that I think people have to look at when they think about a future in this vocation. But again, David, at the end, it's about public service. In the end, you better care about people. You better care about people's outcomes, whether it's a big group of people like society as a whole, whether it's a group of people you represent that says, okay, here's somebody who's being marginalized in society, and I want to show up and fix that.
Okay, that's not a bad way to end it. My last question was, of course, do you have anything you'd like to say that we haven't covered? That's pretty good. But please, if you had something else that you just wanted to say, please do.
Well, I've talked a lot. I'm going to say, take a look at political candidates. Take a look at each one's resume. Take a look at each one's value that you see them bringing. I don't put a label on them right away. And this goes back to that discussion I told you I had with the gentleman from Vancouver. It's like, who is this person you're voting for? Not the stripe of that person, not some nuance around that person or something somebody else told you about that person. Because right now, one of the things you have to put up with in politics is misinformation, including about ourselves. So make sure you do your homework. You're not just listening to the loudest voice on the internet or on Twitter saying this person says or did this. Make sure you actually do a deep dive on each of these candidates. It's that whole thing about being prepared, making good decisions, doing your analysis.
That's been a theme for all the answers you've given us today, and it's not a bad one, right? And we try to talk about that in my classes. And hopefully the students will take that forward as they enter their new career. All right. Well, I just wanted to extend a great thank you to Mr. Greg McLean. He's laid out his views about what the Conservative Party needs to do and what it might do better. And we'll see how it plays out. So thank you very much.
David, thanks for having me. Wonderful to be here.